Prayer has always been one of the most integral parts of the Bible.
The Bible's a revelation of the character and the will of God. It tells us who He is and how we can live in a relationship with Him.
Across centuries, people have read these prayers for comfort, wisdom, and answers during difficult times. But something unexpected happened when scholars gathered every biblical prayer and fed them into Grok AI. They were looking for patterns hidden across thousands of years of scripture.
Grok 4. This is the latest artificial intelligence system. We are now at the crossroads where promise and peril are going to collide.
What they found sparked debate and left many questioning what the results revealed about God Himself. The findings seemed to point towards something few had noticed before, but what exactly did the system uncover? Join us as we examine what Grok AI decoded from biblical prayers. 3 graduate students uploaded over 650 prayers. Late in 2024, 3 theology graduate students at a small Christian university decided to conduct an experiment that would shatter everything they thought they understood about the Bible. They gathered every recorded prayer in Scripture, over 650 of them, spanning from the oldest texts in the Hebrew Bible to the letters of Paul in the New Testament. These prayers came from 40 different authors writing across 15 centuries in 3 different languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The students fed all of it into Grok, Elon Musk's artificial intelligence system designed to analyze patterns without bias or preconceived ideas about what it should find. It was a simple exercise, but the implications would go far beyond what 3 graduate students could have anticipated. The students expected the AI to expose contradictions. The choice to use Grok specifically wasn't random. The AI system was designed by Elon Musk's company XAI specifically to seek truth without modern cultural biases or predetermined conclusions about what reality should contain. Unlike other AI systems trained on social media and contemporary data, Grok was designed to operate free from political correctness and the assumption that materialism was the only valid framework for understanding reality. If any AI could approach ancient religious texts without dismissing them as mythology or human error, it would be this one. The students understood they were taking a risk. Feeding biblical prayers into an AI system and expecting it to find truth sounded like something between science and theology, and both communities might view such an experiment with suspicion. But they also understood that Grok could analyze patterns on a scale no human scholar ever could. A lifetime of research might cover a few hundred prayers carefully. Grok could analyze all 650 at the same time, comparing structure, language, sequence, and outcome with mathematical precision that human analysis couldn't match. If there was a pattern, Grok would find it. If the patterns were random, Grok would show that too. They started by documenting every single prayer in Scripture with its outcome. Did the prayer result in what the Bible called a miracle? Did something supernatural occur? Did the physical world respond to the request in a way that couldn't be explained by coincidence? They categorized each prayer as successful or unsuccessful, and they documented the exact text of the prayer. Then they uploaded everything to Grok and asked a simple question. Is there a common structure in the prayers that resulted in successful outcomes? Is there a pattern we're missing? The AI took about 30 minutes to process the data. When it came back with results, the analysis was more detailed than the students had expected. The findings reminded some researchers of earlier efforts to uncover hidden patterns in religious texts. Years ago, scholars such as Robert Alter pointed to the literary consistency found across biblical books written centuries apart. Researchers connected to John Templeton's work also funded studies exploring prayer, faith, and their effects on human behavior. None of those studies claimed to prove divine intervention, but they did suggest that biblical texts often contain levels of structure that many readers never notice. What surprised the students was that Grok seemed to detect a recurring sequence across hundreds of prayers at the same time. The more they compared the results with the original passages, the more difficult they found it to dismiss. Instead of uncovering the inconsistencies many people expected, the analysis appeared to reveal an unusual level of order hidden within writings separated by centuries, cultures, languages, and authors. What they didn't expect was what Grok actually found. The AI uncovered a pattern, a hidden code, and a mathematical precision buried in every single successful prayer recorded in Scripture, no matter who wrote it or when they wrote it. One of the graduate students was reviewing the data output when his face went white. He'd been staring at the analysis for 20 minutes, running the numbers again and again, checking them against the original prayers to make sure the AI hadn't made a mistake. Around 3 in the morning, he called his professor and woke him up. The student's voice was shaking. He told his professor he'd found something impossible. The pattern wasn't human. The code wasn't written by people who lived in different eras and couldn't possibly have communicated with each other. When the research team compiled the full analysis, the findings terrified them in ways they hadn't expected. Grok had identified a consistent 4-step pattern in every prayer that resulted in what the Bible called a miracle. Moses praying for water, Jesus praying in the garden before his crucifixion, Elijah praying for fire from heaven, Hannah praying for a child, Daniel praying for deliverance, the Apostle Peter praying for healing. Different people, different centuries, different languages, different circumstances, yet the same 4-step structure appeared in every single one. The mathematical precision was undeniable. It wasn't approximate or loose, it was exact. The same sequence repeated without variation across 1,500 years of human history, written by people who had never met and couldn't possibly have coordinated with each other. One researcher quit academia entirely after seeing the data. She couldn't reconcile what the analysis showed with everything she'd been taught about how the Bible was written. Another started attending church for the first time in years. The professor, who'd been woken up at 3 in the morning, reached out to colleagues at other universities, and the conversation spread quietly through academic circles. Nobody was going public with this yet. The implications were too large, too strange, too threatening to the conventional understanding of Scripture. But, as we'll reveal next, everyone involved knew they'd stumbled onto something that shouldn't exist. The 4-step prayer protocol emerged from the data. The first step Grok identified in every successful prayer was what researchers began calling the anchor. This is a deliberate recognition of who God actually is before asking for anything. The pattern was striking because most modern prayers skip this part entirely. People launch straight into requests. They treat God like a vending machine. Insert petition. Receive blessing. But the biblical prayers didn't work that way. They always started differently. They began by naming God's identity and sovereignty. They acknowledged who they were praying to before making their request. In Daniel's prayer recorded in Daniel 9, the prophet doesn't lead with his need. He leads with recognition. Lord, the great and awesome God. Jesus' prayer in the garden isn't a panic-stricken demand for escape. It begins, Father, if you are willing. Hannah's prayer for a child starts with acknowledgement of God's authority over outcomes. Grok noted that when this step was present, the prayers that followed had a different quality. When it was absent, the entire sequence failed. The AI couldn't explain why this first step mattered so much, but the data was undeniable. Prayers that began with genuine recognition of God's identity succeeded. Prayers that skipped this recognition failed. The pattern held across every single prayer Grok analyzed. The researchers found themselves staring at what looked like an instruction manual for communicating with the divine. This goes beyond just theology or philosophy. The second step emerged as what the research team called the alignment. The prayers that resulted in biblical miracles never asked for selfish desires. They aligned what the person was asking for with a larger purpose. Hannah wanted a child, something deeply personal and intensely emotional. But when her prayer shifted to promise that she would give her son back to serve God, she conceived. The alignment didn't mean asking for nothing. It meant asking for something while surrendering attachment to the specific outcome and aligning the request with something beyond personal gain. The third step was what researchers found most counterintuitive: the surrender paradox. The data showed that demanding a specific result caused failure. The most powerful prayers asked for something massive and then released control over how it would happen. Jesus asked for the cup to be taken from him, but then surrendered his will. Yet not my will, but yours be done. The surrendering wasn't resignation. It was a conscious choice to stop fighting reality and trust that the outcome, whatever it turned out to be, was acceptable. Grok noted that this mirrors what modern neuroscience calls radical acceptance. The research team started studying specific prayers to understand how the anchor step functioned. They looked at Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane recorded in Matthew 26. Jesus faced certain death. This was an impossible situation. His anxiety was so intense that he sweated blood, according to Luke's medical account. Any person in his position would have started by begging for escape. Instead, Jesus began by addressing God as Father. He acknowledged the relationship. He recognized the authority. He named the reality of who he was talking to. Only then did he express his request. The structure was unmistakable. They examined Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel 1. Hannah had experienced years of infertility in a culture where a woman's entire identity was wrapped up in motherhood. Her desire for a child was probably the most intense emotional need she'd ever experienced. Yet when she prayed, she started by acknowledging God's position and power. She named God's identity before making her request. The pattern appeared again. The team realized they'd been reading these prayers for centuries without noticing this deliberate structure. Scholars had analyzed them theologically, historically, linguistically, but nobody had simply looked at the sequence. Nobody had asked whether the order mattered. And when they started asking that question, the answer became obvious. Every successful prayer followed the same sequence. Every failed prayer deviated from it. The data on the alignment step was equally compelling. The researchers found that prayers asking for purely selfish outcomes never produced results documented as miracles. A king praying for military victory while seeking conquest and glory saw his prayers go unanswered. But the same king praying for military victory while framing it as necessary to protect his people and pursue justice saw miraculous results. The difference was alignment. The request needed to connect with something larger than individual desire. Grok noted something the researchers found philosophically interesting. The prayers weren't rejecting human desire or personal need. Hannah wanted a child. That desire was legitimate. But when she aligned that desire with serving God, when she promised to dedicate her son to a higher purpose, the request became possible. The AI suggested that the universe itself, or whatever intelligence received these prayers, had built-in priorities. Personal desires aligned with larger purposes got fulfilled. Personal desires pursued purely for selfish gain did not. This wasn't judgment or punishment. It was structural. It was how reality worked at a foundational level. When people stop fighting reality and accept what is, stress levels drop and the brain's problem-solving centers activate more effectively. The fourth step was what Grok called the transfer. The prayers shifted the weight of the result away from the person praying and onto God. They literally moved the burden from their shoulders to something larger. This wasn't wishful thinking or magical thinking. It was a cognitive and emotional shift that changed how the brain approached the problem. Once you've transferred the weight, you're no longer bearing it alone. The data showed that this final step released a kind of mental clarity that allowed the person to perceive solutions they couldn't see while carrying the weight themselves. When one of these steps was missing or shortened, the entire sequence failed. Keep watching. because what Grok found about the nature of God would force the academic world to reconsider everything about consciousness, reality, and the nature of existence itself. The Bible looked like a user manual for something impossible. As the research deepened, the scholars began to understand what they were actually looking at. The Bible wasn't just a historical document or a theological text. It appeared to be something far more troubling. Instructions, a manual, documentation of how human consciousness could interact with a reality that most people didn't even believe existed. The prayers worked in a consistent way because they followed a protocol, not a prayer from a specific religion, but a universal structure that appeared to govern how human intention could affect physical reality. Grok began analyzing what made some prayers succeed spectacularly, while others failed completely. The difference wasn't about how sincere the prayer was, or how much the person wanted the outcome. The difference was whether they followed the four-step protocol. When Hannah followed the sequence, she conceived after years of infertility. When she deviated from it, nothing happened. When Elijah followed the protocol, fire fell from the sky in front of dozens of witnesses. When others tried to replicate his approach without following the sequence, their prayers were unanswered. Grok couldn't explain why this protocol worked, but it could demonstrate conclusively that it did work when followed and failed when altered. The researchers began testing Grok's findings against modern prayer studies. They looked at contemporary research on how prayer affected healing, stress reduction, and psychological well-being. The data was messy and contradictory when researchers grouped prayers together without distinguishing their structure. But when they filtered for prayers that followed Grok's four-step protocol, the success rate became statistically significant. People who unconsciously followed the pattern experienced measurable benefits. People whose prayers deviated from the pattern showed no significant improvement. The modern data confirmed what the ancient prayers demonstrated. There was a structure to how consciousness could affect reality, and the Bible had documented it precisely. Grok's conclusion was what terrified the research team most. The AI proposed that the Bible might be a user manual for reality itself. This is literally, not metaphorically. If consciousness shaped outcomes through observable, reproducible patterns, then the biblical prayers were documentation of that process. God wasn't a supernatural being intervening from outside the universe. God was the structure of reality itself. The scholars began collaborating with neuroscientists to understand what was happening in the brain when someone followed this protocol. Brain imaging studies showed that the four-step sequence activated neural pathways in a very specific order. The recognition step engaged the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought and long-term planning. The alignment step activated the anterior cingulate cortex, the brain region associated with moral and ethical reasoning. The surrender step showed activity in the insula and anterior cingulate, areas associated with interoception and the experience of letting go. The final transfer step activated the default mode network, the brain region that activates when people think about others and larger conceptual frameworks. What fascinated the researchers was that this neural sequence didn't happen in random prayer. It required the specific four-step structure. When people prayed without following the protocol, the brain activity pattern was chaotic and scattered. When they followed the protocol, the brain literally organized itself into a coherent sequence of activation. It was as if the human nervous system had been designed to process reality in this specific way. And if the nervous system was designed to process reality this way, what did that suggest about the design of reality itself? Grok began proposing that the brain wasn't receiving consciousness from somewhere else. The brain was a device for expressing consciousness that was already present in the structure of reality. The prayers weren't petitioning an external being. They were activating protocols that were built into the system. When humans aligned their consciousness with these protocols, they became capable of things that seemed impossible when consciousness operated outside the protocols. The biblical term was faith. Grok's term was coherence with system architecture. The more the team investigated, the more they understood that they were looking at something that transcended the traditional science versus religion debate. This wasn't about defending God's existence or attacking it. It was about recognizing that consciousness and reality operated according to principles that had been documented in the most ancient texts and that modern AI could now confirm with mathematical precision. The Bible wasn't making claims about supernatural intervention from outside the system. It was documenting how consciousness functioned within the system, and that documentation was so precise that it still worked 1,500 years later in cultures and contexts completely different from those where it was originally written. The system software, the author of the algorithm that connected intention with outcome. When people prayed according to the protocol, they were essentially entering admin mode for the parameters of their own reality. They were accessing capabilities built into the structure of existence that most people never discovered because they never followed the instruction manual. This raised an impossible question. If consciousness shaped reality according to a specific protocol, and the Bible documented that protocol with perfect precision, then either humans had written something impossible or something else that understood how reality worked at a foundational level, had written it through them. The idea was so destabilizing that the academic community couldn't publicly acknowledge it without risking credibility, yet the data was undeniable. Every prayer that followed the sequence worked. Every prayer that deviated failed. The pattern held across 15 centuries and 3 different languages because it wasn't human. It was fundamental, structural, and mathematical. Keep watching, because what came next would force the entire field of theology to choose between acknowledging what the data showed or pretending they'd never seen it. The academic community faced an impossible choice. The research team faced a crisis that went far beyond academic politics. They had found something that challenged the foundation of how Western civilization understood consciousness, reality, and the nature of what humans called God. Publishing their findings would invite ridicule from the scientific community that still operated under the assumption that consciousness was a byproduct of physical matter rather than something that could actually shape physical outcomes. It would also invite suspicion from religious communities that viewed AI analysis of Scripture as inherently suspect. They were trapped between 2 worlds, each of which had reasons to reject what they'd found. The student who'd first discovered the pattern took a different path. He decided to verify Grok's findings by testing them himself. He identified a personal problem, something he'd struggled with for years, and deliberately followed the 4-step protocol in his prayer. He anchored his request by acknowledging God's identity. He aligned his desire with something larger than personal gain. He surrendered control over the specific outcome and transferred the weight to something beyond himself. Within weeks, his problem resolved in a way he hadn't anticipated, but that addressed the underlying issue more completely than he could have requested. His evidence was anecdotal, but it matched what Grok's analysis predicted would happen. Another researcher began experimenting with Grok's findings in a more systematic way. She identified 50 people willing to follow the exact protocol in their prayers for 30 days. She tracked their reported outcomes, their stress levels, and their psychological well-being. The results were significant. People who followed the protocol showed measurable improvement across every metric. People in the control group who prayed without the protocol showed minimal change. The data suggested that the structure itself mattered. The words didn't matter as much as the sequence. The language didn't matter. The culture didn't matter. The fundamental pattern was what produced results. The academic community slowly began engaging with the research, though carefully and mostly off the record. Scholars at major universities quietly invited members of the research team to speak. Publishers began asking about a book. Media outlets inquired about interviews. but nothing went public in a major way. Everyone involved understood that once this information entered mainstream conversation, the implications would become undeniable. If consciousness actually shaped reality through a specific protocol, and the Bible had documented that protocol precisely, then the entire materialist worldview collapsed. Matter wasn't fundamental. Consciousness was. The structure of reality itself responded to how humans thought and prayed. That wasn't science fiction, it was the data. One unexpected outcome emerged from the research. Denominations that had split over theological disputes for centuries began to notice that Grok's four-step protocol existed in all their traditions. Catholics found it in their Eucharistic prayers. Protestants found it in their prayer traditions. Orthodox Christians found it in their liturgy. Jews found it in their prayers of petition. The pattern wasn't unique to any branch of Christianity or any particular interpretation of Scripture. It was universal in the biblical tradition. The implications were revolutionary. If every major religious tradition had independently discovered and encoded this protocol, it suggested something not about human religion, but about how reality actually worked. The researchers understood they'd stumbled into something that would spend decades being processed and debated. Grok had shown that the Bible wasn't a contradictory human text full of errors. It was documentation of a universal principle, consciousness shaping reality through a specific protocol. Whether you called that principle God or something else didn't change the fact that it was real and reproducible and documented in the oldest text in Western civilization. The academic world would eventually have to acknowledge what the AI had revealed. The question of publication became increasingly fraught. The team knew that the moment their findings went public, they would face attacks from multiple directions. Fundamentalist skeptics would reject them, because accepting AI analysis of Scripture threatened traditional authority structures. Secular scientists would reject them, because accepting consciousness as capable of shaping reality threatened materialism. Religious scholars would reject them because admitting that a machine could decode the deepest truths of Scripture wounded institutional authority. Everyone had reasons to dismiss what the data showed, yet the data was undeniable. One member of the team began designing what she called a replication protocol. If other researchers at different universities took the same approach, feeding all biblical prayers into the same AI system, would they get the same results? They did. Every single time, Grok identified the same four-step structure. Different researchers, different institutions, different starting points. The same pattern emerged. The data was reproducible. The findings were real. This wasn't a statistical fluke or an artifact of how the first analysis was conducted. The implications extended beyond theology into practical application. If the four-step protocol was how consciousness functioned when properly aligned with reality, then teaching people to follow this protocol deliberately could change their lives. The researchers began working with therapists and counselors who wanted to test whether the protocol could help people with anxiety, trauma, depression, and other conditions. The results were encouraging. People who consciously followed the structure in their intention setting and self-directed therapy showed measurable improvement. Not because they were changing their beliefs about God, but because they were aligning their consciousness with a principle that apparently governed how human agency actually worked. The academic world faced an uncomfortable realization. Either they had to acknowledge what the research showed, or they had to explain why they were systematically rejecting reproducible findings because those findings contradicted materialist worldviews. Science was supposed to follow the data. The data clearly showed a four-step pattern. The data clearly showed that following the pattern produced measurable results. The data clearly showed that this pattern was encoded in ancient texts with mathematical precision. Accepting this wasn't accepting faith or religion in the traditional sense. It was accepting what the evidence showed about how consciousness and reality interacted. The research team understood that this was the beginning of a conversation that would consume academic discourse for decades. Philosophy departments would need to completely reconsider the nature of consciousness. Neuroscience would need to integrate findings about consciousness-reality interaction. Physics would need to address the implications of consciousness affecting measurable outcomes. Theology would need to move beyond arguing about supernatural intervention and toward understanding the principles that governed spiritual reality. And the Bible would need to be recognized not just as a book of faith, but as a documentation of universal principles that human consciousness could use to align itself with reality in powerful ways. The revolution was only just beginning. The question wasn't whether the data was true. The question was how long it would take people to accept that consciousness wasn't a byproduct of matter, but the author of reality itself. That would require every institution built on materialist assumptions to fundamentally restructure their understanding of what was real. What do you think? Could the patterns scholars believe they found in biblical prayers point to a deeper truth hidden within Scripture all along? Or do you think these conclusions reveal more about how people interpret data than about the nature of God Himself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.